How did a young woman from Lima, renowned for her beauty and seemingly destined by the world for a life of comfort, become the first saint of the entire American continent, and the model of a holiness shaped by prayer, penance, and burning charity? Saint Rose of Lima lived for barely 31 years, hidden away in a garden hermitage, devoted to God in silence, yet her name spread throughout the world until she was proclaimed patroness of the Americas and the Philippines. In her, beauty and humility, penance and tenderness, hiddenness and universal fame, the rose and the thorns are joined together. She loved Christ crucified so deeply that she wished to resemble him in suffering. She loved the poor, the sick, and despised indigenous people so much that she turned her home into a refuge for those who suffered. And she loved her city so dearly that, according to tradition, she saved it through her prayers. In this journey, we will draw closer to her life, her renunciations, her mysticism, and her charity, in order to discover this hidden rose among thorns, the first flower of holiness in the New World. Join me in getting to know the Saint of Lima, whose fragrance continues to fill the church 4 centuries later. To understand Saint Rose of Lima, it is helpful first to look at the world in which she lived. The city of Lima, capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, in the 16th century. During the years following the evangelization of America, it was a new world, still taking shape, where the Christian faith, brought by missionaries, was putting down roots in lands recently incorporated into Christendom. In that emerging city was born the woman who would become the first saint of America. Lima had been founded only a few decades before Rose's birth and was already an important city, the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, and the center of power and life in that part of America. It was a city of contrasts, where Spaniards, Creoles, indigenous people, and people of various backgrounds lived alongside one another, with their wealth and poverty, their splendor and misery. There, a new society was taking shape, born of the encounter between worlds, in which the Christian faith played a central role. The Christian faith, brought to America by the missionaries, had taken deep root in those lands and was flourishing in the life of the church, in the religious orders, in the evangelization of indigenous peoples, and in charity toward the poor. Lima was a city of profound Christian life, filled with churches, convents, and charitable works. And it was precisely in that era and in that city that several saints flourished, so that Lima came to be called a city of saints. Indeed, Lima at that time witnessed an admirable flowering of holiness. Alongside Saint Rose, other saints lived in Lima during the same period or nearby eras, including Saint Turribius of Mogrovejo, Archbishop of Lima, Saint Martin de Porres, the humble Dominican religious, Saint John Machias, and others. That emerging city of the New World became, so to speak, a garden of holiness in which several saints blossomed almost at the same time. Rose was the first flower in that garden to be canonized. Placing Saint Rose within 16th century Lima therefore helps us understand her world, an emerging city of the New World, rich in Christian life, which became the birthplace of an admirable flowering of holiness. In that city of saints, Rose was the first to be raised to the altars, the first saint of the entire American continent, and in that city, within a Christian family, was born the girl who would become Saint Rose, bearing the name Isabel Flores de Oliva. Saint Rose of Lima was born in the city of Lima in 1586, and at baptism she was given the name Isabel Flores de Oliva. This was her real name, for the name Rose, by which history would know her, came later, as we shall see. She was born into a Christian family of modest means, where faith and Christian virtues were cultivated. Isabel's parents were Gaspar Flores and Maria de Oliva, a humble or modest family who lived by their work. They were neither wealthy nor members of high society, but simple people who raised their many children with hard work and in the Christian faith. Isabel was one of several siblings in a large family, where from an early age she came to know the work and hardships associated with modest circumstances. The family's poverty shaped her childhood. In that Christian home, Isabel received an education in faith and virtue. Although her parents were of modest means, they passed on to her the Christian faith, piety, and the virtues she would later develop in an admirable way. The girl grew up in an atmosphere of faith, learning to pray, to love God, and to practice virtue. The Christian education she received at home was the foundation upon which her sanctity would be built. From a very young age, Isabel showed an exceptional inclination toward the things of God, a piety and devotion uncommon in a child of her age. She was drawn to prayer, sacred things, and penance, with an intensity that astonished those around her. Her soul seemed inclined toward God from childhood, and signs of a singular vocation to holiness could already be perceived in her. The girl from Lima was destined for great things. Isabel Flores de Oliva, born in Lima in 1586 into a Christian family of modest means, was thus the child who would become Saint Rose of Lima. In that simple home, she received the faith and virtues that would form the foundation of her sanctity, and from an early age she showed a singular inclination toward God. And it was precisely during her childhood, according to tradition, that the episode occurred which gave her the name by which history would know her, Rose. Although she received the name Isabel at baptism, Saint Rose is known to history as Rose, a name she acquired in childhood according to a pious tradition worth knowing, while distinguishing tradition from established historical fact. This name of Rose, which would mark her entire life, has an origin surrounded by beauty in tradition. Tradition relates that, when Isabel was still a nursing infant, a maid who cared for her saw her face transformed into a beautiful rose, or possessing a beauty reminiscent of a rose. For this reason, and because of the child's beauty, people began calling her Rose, and this name eclipsed Isabel. Whatever the exact truth of the story, it is certain that Isabel was called Rose from childhood, and by this name she would pass into history. Tradition adds that Rose's mother encouraged the name because of the child's beauty, while, according to some accounts, there was initially some hesitation because it was not her baptismal name. But the name Rose prevailed, and everyone came to know the child by it. Later, at her confirmation, according to some accounts, she added the name Mary to her own, becoming Rose of Saint Mary, and thus joining the name of the flower to that of the Virgin, whom she loved so dearly. The name Rose would prove prophetic and rich in symbolism throughout her life. The rose is a beautiful flower, but one surrounded by thorns, and Rose's life would indeed be a life of beauty and holiness, yet surrounded by the thorns of penance and suffering. The rose among the thorns would become an image of her life, the flower of holiness and love for God, blossoming amid the thorns of penance and the cross. Her name announced, so to speak, her destiny. The name Rose, which she was given in childhood according to tradition, is therefore the name by which Isabel Flores de Oliva would go down in history as Saint Rose of Lima. It is fitting to receive the account of its origin as a pious tradition, distinguishing it from established history. The symbolic meaning of the name, the rose among the thorns, foreshadowed the life of beauty and penance that Rose was to live. And from childhood, Rose showed the first signs of that holiness, with a piety and penitence astonishing for her age. From her earliest childhood, Rose showed signs of extraordinary holiness and piety, uncommon in a girl of her age. These first signs, which amazed those around her, announced the unique vocation to holiness that God had reserved for her. From an early age, the girl from Lima was turning toward total self-giving to God. From childhood, Rose felt drawn to prayer and to the things of God. She liked to withdraw to pray, sought silence and recollection, and avoided the frivolous amusements typical of her age. While other children played, Rose felt drawn to prayer, contemplation, and sacred things. This early inclination toward the interior life was a sign of the grace at work within her and of her vocation to holiness. As a child, Rose began to practice penance and mortification, with an intensity astonishing for her age. She went without certain foods and sweets, imposed small sacrifices on herself, and sought mortification out of love for God. This inclination toward penance, which would grow over the years until it became heroic, was already evident in the child, moved by her love for Christ and her desire to imitate him. It is important, however, to understand this penance in the light of her love, not as meaningless rigor. From childhood, Rose also showed great devotion to the Virgin Mary, whom she loved with a tender, filial love, and took as her mother and model. Her Marian devotion, which would accompany her throughout her life, was already evident in her childhood, in her love for the Virgin, and her desire to imitate her. According to tradition, she added the name Mary to her own, calling herself Rose of Saint Mary, as a sign of her love for the Mother of God. The Virgin was always her guide and her mother. With these first signs of holiness, the devout child presents the portrait of Rose in her childhood, a girl drawn to prayer, inclined toward penance, devoted to the Virgin, and oriented from an early age toward total self-giving to God. These signs announce the unique vocation to holiness that God had reserved for her. And as Rose grew, she had to face a reality that, for many young women, is a source of vanity, but for her became an occasion for profound renunciation, her beauty. As Rose grew, her great physical beauty became increasingly noticeable. Everyone admired it, and for many young women of her station, it would have been a source of vanity and worldly aspirations. But for Rose, her beauty became an occasion for profound renunciation, for she understood that it could be an obstacle to her dedication to God, and decided neither to cultivate it nor to use it to her advantage. According to the testimony of those who knew her, Rose was a young woman of remarkable beauty, admired by all who met her. Her beauty attracted attention and inspired admiration, and it could have opened the doors to a good marriage and a comfortable life, in keeping with the ordinary aspirations of young women of her time. Her mother, in particular, wanted Rose to cultivate her beauty and seek a good marriage that would improve the family's circumstances. But Rose, who had decided to consecrate herself to God, understood that her beauty could be an obstacle to her self-giving, a source of vanity for herself and of attraction for suitors. For this reason, she decided not to cultivate her beauty, but rather to conceal and even despise it, so that nothing would hinder her journey toward God. Her heart was set on God, not on the things of the world, and she did not want her beauty to distract her from her purpose. Tradition recounts various episodes of Rose's renunciation of her beauty, some of which should be understood in the light of her love for God and her desire to overcome vanity. It is said that, so as not to be admired for her beauty, Rose concealed it and even mistreated herself, seeking not to please men, but God alone. These episodes, which may surprise us today, express her radical renunciation of vanity and her desire to consecrate herself entirely to God, although they should be understood in their context and not imitated without discernment. Rose's beauty and her first renunciation thus reveal her radical choice of God from her youth. She, who was admired for her beauty, decided neither to cultivate it nor to make use of it, but to consecrate herself entirely to God, overcoming vanity. Her renunciation of beauty, an ordinary occasion of vanity, is an eloquent sign of her love for God above all things. This renunciation became even clearer when Rose, overcoming the opposition of her family, offered her beauty and her whole heart to God, consecrating herself to him by a vow. Rose's renunciation of her beauty was, at heart, a victory over vanity and an offering of her beauty to God. Rose overcame vanity, that attachment to one's own beauty and to the esteem of others which so strongly attracts souls, and offered her beauty and her whole heart to God. This victory over vanity is one of the most admirable and relevant features of her life. Vanity, the attachment to one's own beauty, to the esteem of others, and to the world's admiration, is a common temptation, especially in youth, and particularly for those blessed with beauty. Endowed with great beauty, Rose could have fallen into vanity, cultivating her appearance and seeking admiration. But moved by her love for God, she overcame this temptation and decided to offer her beauty to God rather than use it for her own glory. Rose understood that true beauty does not lie in physical attractiveness, which is fleeting, but in the beauty of the soul, in grace and holiness. For this reason, she did not cultivate her physical beauty, but rather her interior beauty, that of a soul adorned with virtue and grace. She preferred to please God with the beauty of her soul, rather than men with the beauty of her body. Her renunciation of physical beauty was thus a choice in favor of interior beauty, the only beauty of eternal value. This victory over vanity has made Rose a model and intercessor against this vice, and a patroness invoked by those who wish to overcome vanity and value inner beauty above outward beauty. In a world like ours, so obsessed with appearance, physical beauty, and the admiration of others, Rose's example, she who overcame vanity and offered her beauty to God, remains remarkably relevant. Rose teaches us not to live for appearances, but for God. Vanity overcome and beauty offered to God are therefore among the most admirable and relevant features of Saint Rose's life. Endowed with great beauty, she offered it to God and overcame vanity, preferring the beauty of the soul to that of the body. Her example is especially valuable in a world obsessed with appearances. This victory over vanity and her self-giving to God were sealed when Rose, determined to consecrate herself entirely to the Lord, made a vow of virginity and rejected offers of marriage. Determined to consecrate herself entirely to God, Rose made a vow of virginity while she was still young. By this vow, she consecrated herself wholly to God, renouncing marriage in order to belong to Him alone. This vow and her subsequent rejection of marriage proposals became one of the great decisions of her life and the occasion of a bitter struggle with her family. From an early age, Rose had understood that God was calling her to consecrate herself entirely to Him, and she decided to answer this call by making a vow of virginity, offering God her whole heart. Through this vow, Rose consecrated herself wholly to God, renouncing marriage and family life in order to belong to the Lord alone. Her heart was set on Christ, whom she had chosen as her only spouse, and she desired no love other than His. This decision, however, clashed with the wishes of her family, especially her mother, who wanted Rose to marry and thereby improve the family's circumstances. Her beauty and qualities opened the way to a good marriage, and her mother insisted that she accept one of the proposals she received. Rose, therefore, had to endure a bitter struggle with her family, who pressured her to marry while she remained steadfast in her resolve to consecrate herself to God. Rose stood firm in her decision despite the pressure and the marriage proposals. With patience and humility, but also with firmness, she resisted the attempts to arrange a marriage for her and persevered in her resolve to consecrate herself to God. Her fidelity to her vow, amid her family's pressure, reveals the strength of her vocation and the depth of her love for God. She preferred to disappoint her family's wishes rather than fail in her dedication to Christ. The vow of virginity and the rejection of marriage were therefore among the great decisions of Rose's life, and the occasion of a bitter struggle with her family, from which she emerged victorious through her fidelity to God. Through this vow, Rose consecrated herself entirely to Christ, her only spouse, and in order to live out her consecration, Rose sought a model and guide in a great saint whom she admired and wished to imitate, Saint Catherine of Siena. In order to live out her consecration to God, Rose found a model and guide in a great saint of the Middle Ages, whom she admired and wished to imitate, Saint Catherine of Siena, the celebrated Dominican mystic. Rose's devotion to Saint Catherine and her desire to imitate her profoundly shaped her spiritual life and vocation. Saint Catherine of Siena had been a great saint, mystic, and Dominican tertiary, renowned for her life of penance, prayer, and charity, as well as for her role in the church of her time. After learning about her life, Rose was drawn to her example and decided to take her as her model and teacher, imitating her life of penance, prayer, and dedication to God. Catherine became her guide and inspiration. From Saint Catherine of Siena, Rose learned many features of her spirituality: love for Christ crucified, penance, a life of prayer, charity toward the poor and the sick, and consecration to God as a Dominican tertiary. Rose wanted to imitate Catherine in everything and followed her example in the way she lived. Saint Catherine's influence on Rose was profound, shaping both her vocation and her spirituality. Following Saint Catherine's example, Rose decided to consecrate herself to God, not in a convent, but in the world, as a Dominican tertiary, living a life of prayer, penance, and charity in her own home. Like Catherine, who had been a Dominican tertiary and had lived out her consecration in the midst of the world, Rose embraced this form of life, joining her consecration to God with life in her household. Catherine's example thus shaped the concrete form of Rose's vocation. Saint Catherine of Siena, Rose's model and teacher, therefore had a profound influence on her spiritual life and vocation. Rose took her as her guide and imitated her love for Christ crucified, her penance, her prayer, her charity, and her consecration as a Dominican tertiary living in the world. Following this model, Rose took the step of consecrating herself to God by receiving the habit of the Third Order of Saint Dominic. Following the example of Saint Catherine of Siena, Rose consecrated herself to God as a Dominican tertiary, receiving the habit of the Third Order of Saint Dominic and living out her consecration in her own home, in the midst of the world. This way of life, which united consecration to God with remaining at home, was the one Rose embraced, and it shaped her life. The Third Order of Saint Dominic, like the third orders of other religious families, was a way of life that allowed lay people, both men and women, to share in the spirituality of the order and consecrate themselves to God while living in the world without entering a convent. Tertiaries wore a habit, made certain promises or vows, and lived according to a rule adapted to their condition, sharing in Dominican spirituality. It was a form of consecration accessible to those living in the midst of the world. Rose received the habit of a Dominican tertiary and, through it, consecrated herself to God, joining the family of Saint Dominic. She wore the black and white habit of the Dominican women religious and lived according to the spirit of the order, participating in its life of prayer and devotion. As a tertiary, Rose did not live in a convent, but in her own home. Nevertheless, she led a life of consecration, prayer, and penance as though she were living in a cloister. This way of life, which united consecration to God with remaining at home, had both advantages and difficulties. It allowed Rose to consecrate herself to God without leaving her family, whom she helped through her work, but it also exposed her to the tensions of family life and to the incomprehension of her own relatives. Rose knew how to live out her consecration amid these circumstances, making her home a place of prayer and penance, and sanctifying herself in the midst of family life. The Dominican tertiary, wearing the habit of Saint Dominic, was therefore the way of life Rose embraced, following the example of Saint Catherine of Siena, a consecration to God lived out in her own home, in the midst of the world. Through the Dominican habit, Rose joined the family of Saint Dominic and lived a life of prayer and penance. To support herself and help her family, Rose combined her life of prayer with the work of her hands, sowing and cultivating her garden. Rose's life was not solely one of prayer and penance, but also of work, for she helped support her family through the work of her hands, sowing and cultivating her garden. This dimension of her life, the work she undertook to support herself and her family, reveals the realism and humility of her holiness, lived out amid ordinary tasks. Rose's family was of modest means and was facing financial difficulties, so Rose had to contribute to the family's support through her work. She devoted herself to sewing and other kinds of manual labor, as well as to cultivating her garden, from which she obtained flowers and other products to sell. Through the fruits of her labor, Rose helped support her family, thus uniting work with her life of prayer and penance. In addition to serving the purpose of providing for her needs, Rose's work had spiritual value. She carried it out in God's presence, out of love for Him and for her family, and as an exercise in humility and service. Manual labor, joined to prayer, made her life a synthesis of contemplation and action, in keeping with the ideal of so many saints. Rose sanctified her work, turning it into an offering to God and a service to her family. The cultivation of the garden held a special meaning in Rose's life, for it was there that, besides working, she would build her hermitage, the place of her prayer and retreat, which we will discuss later. The garden was thus both a place of work and a place of prayer, a space of sustenance and a space of contemplation. The flowers Rose cultivated, especially roses, would become a symbol of her life, linked to the name she bore. Her work and livelihood, through sewing and gardening, thus reveal the realism and humility of Rose's holiness, lived out amid ordinary tasks. Rose united the work of her hands, by which she supported herself and her family, with her life of prayer and penance, thus sanctifying her work. And in that garden where she worked, Rose built the most important place in her spiritual life, the hermitage where she withdrew to pray, hidden among the flowers. One of the most distinctive and beautiful features of the life of Saint Rose of Lima is the hermitage she built in the garden of her home, a small cell where she withdrew to pray and do penance, hidden among the flowers. That hermitage, the work of her own hands, became the center of her spiritual life, the place where she encountered God in silence and solitude. Longing for greater solitude in which to devote herself to prayer and penance, Rose built a small hermitage or hut in the garden of her home with her own hands, where she withdrew to pray. That poor tiny cell, hidden among the flowers in the garden, became her place of retreat, her little cloister, where she spent long hours in prayer and penance, apart from the bustle of the household and the world. In that garden hermitage, Rose lived, in a certain sense, as a hermit, in solitude and silence, devoted to prayer and contemplation. Although she had not entered a convent but lived at home, she had built her own space of solitude and recollection in the garden, where she could devote herself to God without distraction. That small cell was Rose's desert, the place where she encountered God intimately. The garden hermitage has a profound spiritual meaning. It reveals Rose's desire for solitude and recollection in order to devote herself to God, and her need for a space of silence amid family life and the world. Just as hermits withdrew into the desert to seek God in solitude, so Rose withdrew to her garden hermitage to seek God in silence and recollection. Her hermitage was the place of her hidden life in God. The garden hermitage, Saint Rose of Lima's cell of prayer, is therefore one of the most distinctive and beautiful features of her life. Built with her own hands and hidden among the flowers, it became the center of her spiritual life, the place where she encountered God in solitude and silence. And in that garden where her hermitage stood, the flowers, especially roses, became a symbol of her life and her name. The flowers in Saint Rose of Lima's garden, especially the roses, carry a profound symbolic meaning in her life, linked to the name she bore. The rose, a beautiful flower surrounded by thorns, became an image of Rose's life, beauty and holiness blossoming amid the thorns of penance and suffering. Rose cultivated flowers in her garden, and among them, fittingly for her name, roses held a special place. The flowers were not merely a means of subsistence, but also an object of contemplation, in which Rose saw the work of God and a symbol of spiritual realities. The beauty of the flowers spoke to her of the beauty of God and of souls, and roses in particular spoke to her of her own life and name. The rose is a flower of great beauty, but surrounded by thorns. This characteristic of the rose became an image of the life of Saint Rose. Her life was indeed like a rose, beautiful because of the beauty of her holiness and her love for God, but surrounded by the thorns of penance, suffering, and trials. The rose among the thorns is a perfect image of her life, in which the flower of holiness blossomed amid the thorns of the cross. This symbolism of the rose among the thorns has a profound spiritual meaning. It teaches that holiness and the beauty of the soul often blossom amid suffering and penance, like the rose among the thorns. The beauty of the rose does not exist without the thorns, and Rose's holiness did not exist without suffering and penance. The flower and the thorns go together, just as holiness and the cross do. Rose's life was a rose blossoming among thorns. The roses and the symbolism of her life are therefore a beautiful aspect of the figure of Saint Rose, linked to her name. The rose, a beautiful flower surrounded by thorns, is an image of her life, in which the beauty of holiness blossomed amid the thorns of penance and suffering. And in her garden hermitage among the flowers, Rose devoted herself to an intense life of prayer and contemplation, which was the soul of her entire existence. The soul of St. Rose's entire life was prayer, to which she devoted herself intensely in her garden hermitage and throughout the whole of her day. Rose was, above all, a woman of prayer, a contemplative whose entire life was directed toward union with God. Her intense life of prayer was the source of her holiness and of all her works. Rose devoted long hours to prayer, both in her garden hermitage and in church, especially before the Blessed Sacrament. She rose at night to pray, spent long periods in contemplation, and throughout the day maintained a constant awareness of God's presence. Her prayer was not merely the recitation of formulas, but an intimate relationship with God, a union of love, a contemplation of the mysteries of Christ. Prayer filled her life. In her prayer, Rose contemplated in a special way the passion of Christ, whom she loved with an ardent love. She meditated on the Lord's sufferings, shared in his sorrows, and united herself to him in his passion. This love for Christ crucified was the center of her spiritual life, and from it flowed her penance, her desire to imitate him in suffering, and her self-offering. Rose also contemplated the mysteries of Christ's life and the greatness of the Virgin Mary, whom she loved so dearly. Rose's life of prayer was accompanied by mystical graces, experiences of God's presence, consolations, and also interior trials, which we will discuss later. Her prayer led her to a profound union with God and to mystical experiences of the highest degree. Rose was a true contemplative, favored by God with singular graces that united her ever more intimately to him. Her hidden life in the garden was a life of the highest contemplation. The life of prayer and contemplation of Saint Rose was therefore the soul of her entire existence, the source of her holiness and of all her works. Rose was, above all, a woman of prayer, a contemplative whose entire life was directed toward union with God and especially toward contemplation of Christ crucified. And from this love for Christ crucified sprang one of the most characteristic and, at the same time, most delicate features of her life, her penance, which should be understood in the light of her love. One of the most characteristic and at the same time most difficult to understand aspects of Saint Rose's life is her penance, which was extraordinarily rigorous. This aspect of her life should be approached with care and balance, understood in the light of her love for Christ crucified, and without falling into a misguided admiration that might lead us to imitate her mortifications without discernment. Rose practiced extraordinary penance and mortification, moved by her love for Christ crucified and by her desire to imitate him in suffering. She fasted rigorously, slept little and on an extremely hard bed, imposed various bodily mortifications on herself, and sought suffering out of love for Christ. Her penance was astonishingly severe, and must be understood not as an end in itself, but as an expression of her love for Christ and her desire to unite herself to him in his passion. The foundation of Rose's penance was her love for Christ crucified. Contemplating the Lord's sufferings and moved by love, Rose desired to unite herself to him in suffering, to share in his passion, and to make reparation for the sins of humanity. Her penance was thus an expression of love, a desire to resemble Christ in his suffering and to share his cross. She did not seek suffering for its own sake, but as a path of union with Christ crucified, whom she loved above all things. Nevertheless, Rose's penance should be approached with balance and discernment. In proposing Rose as a model, the Church does not propose that we imitate her extraordinary mortifications, which were the fruit of a singular grace and vocation, but rather her love of God, her spirit of penance and reparation, and her desire to unite herself to Christ. The ordinary path of Christian penance is more moderate and must always be lived with discretion and under the guidance of the Church. What we are to imitate in Rose is her love, not necessarily her rigor. Rose's penance, understood in the light of her love for Christ crucified, is therefore one of the most characteristic features of her life, and should be received with balance and discernment. Her extraordinary penance was an expression of her love for Christ and her desire to unite herself to him in his passion. But what the Church proposes for imitation is her love, not her rigor. And one of the most eloquent signs of this penance born of love was the crown of thorns that Rose wore hidden beneath the flowers. Among the signs of Saint Rose's penance, one of the most famous and eloquent is the crown of thorns she wore hidden on her head, covered with flowers so that it could not be seen. This detail, which unites the symbolism of the rose and the thorns with her love for Christ crucified, is one of the most moving aspects of her life, and should once again be understood in the light of her love. Tradition relates that Rose, moved by her love for Christ, crowned with thorns, wore on her head a small crown with points or thorns, in remembrance and imitation of the Lord's crown of thorns. So that it would not be seen, and so that she would not be admired or pitied, she covered it with a garland of flowers, roses. Thus, beneath the flowers that everyone could see, Rose hid the thorns of her penance, joining together the symbols of the rose and the thorns. This detail is immensely beautiful and deeply symbolic. The crown of thorns, hidden beneath the flowers, is an image of Rose's entire life. Beneath the beauty of the flowers, of youth, and of outward appearance, she hid the thorns of penance, suffering, and love for Christ crucified. No one saw the thorns, everyone saw the flowers, but beneath the flowers were the thorns. Such was Rose's life, beautiful outwardly, penitential within, hidden in God. The hidden crown of thorns also expresses Rose's humility, for she did not want her penance to be seen or admired. She concealed her mortifications so that she would undertake them solely out of love for God and not out of vanity. She covered the thorns with flowers so that no one would see them, seeking to please only God, who sees what is hidden. Her penance was concealed, carried out in secret out of love for Christ, without seeking the esteem of others. Humility thus accompanied her penance. The crown of thorns hidden beneath the flowers is therefore one of the most famous and eloquent signs of Saint Rose's penance, uniting the symbolism of the rose and the thorns with her love for Christ crucified and with her humility. Beneath the flowers, Rose hid the thorns of her penance, undertaken in secret out of love. As always, this detail should be understood in the light of her love, rather than imitated without discernment. And this life of prayer and penance, undertaken out of love, was accompanied by God with extraordinary mystical graces, but also with severe interior trials. Saint Rose's life of prayer and penance was accompanied by God with extraordinary mystical graces, experiences of God's presence and love that united her ever more intimately to Him. But alongside these graces, Rose also had to pass through severe interior trials, dryness and temptations, which form part of the path of the great mystics. God favored Rose with unique mystical graces, experiences of His presence, spiritual consolations, visions, and a profound union with the Lord. These graces, characteristic of souls whom God raises to a high degree of contemplation, filled her soul with God's love and presence and confirmed her in her self-giving. In prayer, Rose enjoyed a unique intimacy with God, which united her ever more closely to Him. Yet alongside these consolations, Rose also had to pass through severe interior trials. Like so many mystics, she experienced dryness, darkness, temptations, moments when God seemed absent and the soul felt alone and tested. These trials, known in the spiritual tradition as the dark night of the soul, form part of the path of purification by which God leads souls whom He wishes to unite more intimately to Himself. Rose endured them with faith and perseverance. These interior trials had a purifying purpose. Through them, God purified Rose's soul, stripped her of every attachment, and united her more fully to Himself. The dryness and darkness accepted in faith did not draw her away from God. Rather, they purified and strengthened her. Rose learned to remain faithful to God in darkness as well, to love Him without feeling consolation, and to trust Him amid trial. Her faithfulness in times of trial is a sign of the authenticity of her mystical life. Mystical graces and interior trials were therefore part of Saint Rose's spiritual journey. God favored her with unique gifts, but she also had to pass through severe trials of purification. Consolations and dryness, graces and trials alternated along her path toward union with God. And this union with God reached in Rose an exalted summit, which tradition has expressed through the image of mystical marriage with Christ. Saint Rose's union with God reached an exalted summit, which tradition has expressed through the image of mystical marriage with Christ. That is, a union of love so intimate between the soul and Christ that it is compared to the union of spouses. This mystical marriage, which is also mentioned in the lives of other great mystics, such as Saint Catherine of Siena, is one of the signs of Rose's supreme holiness. Mystical marriage is a mystical grace by which the soul is united to Christ with a love so intimate and complete that it is compared to the union between spouses. It is clearly not a physical union, but a spiritual union of love, in which the soul gives itself entirely to Christ, and Christ gives Himself to the soul in a singular intimacy. This grace, reserved for souls whom God raises to a high degree of holiness, expresses the summit of mystical union with God. Tradition tells us that Saint Rose was favored by Christ with this grace of mystical marriage, through which she was united to him with a singular love, taking him as her bridegroom. Just as Saint Catherine of Siena, her model, had received this grace, so Rose, according to tradition, was united to Christ in a mystical marriage, sealed, according to some accounts, with a sign such as a ring. Christ thus became the bridegroom of her soul, and Rose his bride. This mystical marriage expresses the fullness of Rose's union with Christ, the fruit of her entire life of prayer, penance, and love. Rose, who had offered Christ her virginity and her whole heart, who had chosen him as her only bridegroom, was now united to him in the most intimate union of love. Her total self-giving to Christ found its culmination in this mystical union, which made her entirely his. The love that had guided her whole life reached its fulfillment. Mystical marriage with Christ is therefore the summit of St. Rose's union with God, an expression of the supreme holiness to which God raised her. United to Christ in the most intimate union of love, Rose attained the fullness of her self-giving. As always, these mystical accounts should be received with reverence, acknowledging Rose's supreme holiness. And this union with Christ, attained amid graces and trials, did not distance Rose from others. Rather, it impelled her to charity, especially toward the poor and the sick. Although we have already spoken of Saint Rose's interior trials, it is worthwhile to pause, especially over that profound trial which the spiritual tradition calls the dark night of the soul, a trial Rose passed through like so many great mystics, and which was an essential part of her path of purification and union with God. The dark night of the soul is an interior trial through which God leads the souls he wishes to unite more intimately to himself. In it, the soul is deprived of sensible consolations, plunged into dryness and darkness, and at times assailed by temptations and by the feeling of having been abandoned by God. It is a painful but purifying trial, through which the soul is stripped of every attachment and united to God in a purer and more complete way. Saint Rose passed through this dark night, experiencing dryness, darkness, and temptations. There were moments when God seemed absent, when Rose's soul felt alone and tested, and when temptations assailed her. These moments of trial, which tradition records in her life, were for Rose a time of purification and growth, during which her faith and love were tested and strengthened. Rose remained faithful to God even in the darkness. Rose's fidelity during the dark night is one of the signs of the authenticity and depth of her spiritual life. She did not love God only for the consolations she received from him. She remained faithful to him also in dryness and trial, loving him for his own sake. This fidelity in darkness, this love that does not depend on consolations, is characteristic of souls who have attained a high degree of holiness. In the dark night, Rose showed the purity and depth of her love for God. The dark night, with its dryness and temptations, was therefore a profound trial that Saint Rose endured, like so many great mystics, and it was an essential part of her journey of purification and union with God. Her fidelity in the darkness reveals the depth of her love for God, which did not depend on consolations. And this love for God, tested in the dark night, expressed itself in an ardent love for her neighbor, especially the poor and the sick, to whom Rose devoted herself with admirable charity. Saint Rose's love for God expressed itself in an ardent love for her neighbor, especially the poor and the sick, to whom she devoted herself with admirable charity. Rose was not only a contemplative and a penitent, but also a woman of ardent charity, who saw the face of Christ in the poor and the sick, and served them with love. Rose felt deep compassion for the poor, the sick, and those who suffered, and devoted herself to helping them with ardent charity. She shared with them the little she had, assisted them in their needs, and comforted them in their sorrows. Her heart, enamored of Christ, opened itself to those who suffered, in whom she saw the face of the Lord. Rose's charity was the expression toward her neighbor of the love she had for God. Rose took special care of the sick, whom she tended and looked after with love. She visited them, treated them, and comforted them, without shrinking from the repulsiveness of illness or the fatigue of caring for them. She saw suffering Christ in the sick and served them as she would the Lord himself. Her charity toward the sick was heroic, moved by love for Christ, who had said that whatever is done for the least of his own is done for him, according to the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 25. Rose's charity also extended to the most despised members of the society of her time, the poor, the indigenous people, and those whom no one cared for. Rose made no distinctions among people. Rather, she devoted herself to all who suffered, and especially to the poorest and most despised, in whom she saw Christ. Her universal and ardent charity led her to help those most in need, regardless of their status. In this respect, she was, in a certain sense, ahead of the social welfare initiatives of later times. St. Rose's charity toward the poor and the sick shows, then, that her love for God expressed itself in an ardent love for her neighbor. Rose was not only a contemplative and a penitent, but also a woman of heroic charity, who saw the face of Christ in the poor and the sick, and served them with love. This charity led her to undertake a remarkable initiative, for which she has come to be regarded as a pioneer of social charity, turning a corner of her home into an infirmary to care for the sick. One of the most notable expressions of St. Rose's charity, and one that has led her to be regarded as a pioneer of social charity, was her decision to welcome the sick and those in need into her own home, turning a corner of it into a kind of infirmary where she cared for those who suffered. This initiative reveals the breadth of her charity and, in a certain sense, its pioneering character. Moved by charity, Rose began welcoming the sick, the elderly, and needy children into her home, where she tended and cared for them. She set aside a space in her house to receive those who suffered, and there she treated them, fed them, and comforted them. Her home thus became a small refuge of charity, a kind of infirmary or domestic hospital where the poor and the sick found welcome and care. This initiative of Rose has been regarded as an anticipation of the social assistance and care for the sick that would be developed in later times. In her home, Rose cared for those whom the society of her day often neglected, the poor, sick, abandoned elderly people, and needy children. Her home infirmary was a concrete and organized work of charity that, in a certain sense, anticipated social assistance institutions. For this reason, she has been considered a pioneer of social love and care for the sick. It is admirable that Rose united the highest contemplation with the most concrete charity in this way. She was not content simply to pray and do penance. She translated her love for God into concrete service to the poor and the sick, welcoming them into her home. In this way, contemplation and action, love of God and love of neighbor, the hidden life of the hermitage and the active charity of the infirmary were united in her. Rose was both a contemplative and a servant of the poor. The infirmary in her home, which makes Saint Rose a pioneer of social love, thus reveals the scope of her charity and its forward-looking character. Rose welcomed the sick and those in need into her home, uniting contemplation with concrete charity and love of God with service to the poor. This charity was directed especially toward the most despised people in the society of her time, particularly indigenous people, whom Rose loved with special devotion. St. Rose's charity was directed especially toward the most despised people in the society of her time, particularly indigenous people and the poor, whom Rose loved with special devotion. In a society marked by inequality and contempt, Rose drew near to those whom no one wanted, seeing in them the face of Christ and loving them without distinction. The society of Lima at that time was marked by profound inequalities, and indigenous people, as well as the poor and enslaved people, often occupied the lowest and most despised positions. Many looked down on them or neglected them. Rose, by contrast, approached them with love, making no distinctions among people and seeing in each one, whatever their condition, a child of God and an image of Christ. Rose felt a special compassion for indigenous people who often suffered poverty, contempt, and marginalization. She assisted them, cared for them, and loved them, treating them with the same dignity and love as anyone else. Her charity recognized no distinctions of race or social status. Rather, it was directed toward all who suffered, especially the most despised. In this, Rose manifested the spirit of the gospel, which proclaims the equal dignity of all people before God. Rose's love for indigenous people and the despised has profound significance, including for our own time. In a world still marked by inequality, contempt, and marginalization, the example of Rose, who loved the most despised and saw Christ in them, remains fully relevant. Rose teaches us to look upon everyone with love, without distinction of race or social status, and to draw especially near to the poorest and most despised in whom Christ is present. Saint Rose's love for indigenous people and the despised thus reveals the universal scope of her charity, which recognized no distinctions and was directed especially toward the poorest and most marginalized. She saw Christ in them and loved them with special devotion. Her example remains highly relevant. And this love for her city and her people was also manifested, according to tradition, in a celebrated episode in which Rose is said to have saved Lima from danger through her prayers. Among the celebrated episodes in the life of Saint Rose of Lima, tradition recalls one in which Rose is said to have saved the city of Lima from danger through her prayers during a pirate attack. This episode should be approached as a pious tradition, distinguishing what belongs to tradition from what is strictly documented history. Tradition tells us that on one occasion, pirates, according to Dutch accounts, threatened the city of Lima or its port, causing great fear among its inhabitants. Faced with this danger, tradition says that Rose went to the church and there, before the Blessed Sacrament, prayed fervently for the city's salvation, even prepared, according to some accounts, to defend the Blessed Sacrament with her life if the pirates managed to enter. Her prayer is said to have been heard, and the city is said to have been saved from danger. According to tradition, the danger passed, and the city was saved, which was attributed to Rose's prayers and to God's protection. Some accounts add details, such as a storm that supposedly scattered the attackers. As always, these accounts should be received with prudence, distinguishing the core of the tradition, Rose's prayer for her city, from details that may belong to legend or later embellishment. Beyond the details, this episode expresses Rose's love for her city and its people, and her trust in the power of prayer. Rose loved Lima, her city, and its inhabitants, and in the moment of danger she turned to prayer, placing the city's salvation in God's hands. Her readiness to defend the Blessed Sacrament, according to tradition, also reveals her love for the Eucharist and her courage. This episode has helped lead to Rose's veneration as the patroness and protectress of Lima. The defense of Lima, according to the tradition concerning the pirates, is therefore a celebrated episode in the life of Saint Rose of Lima, which should be received as a pious tradition and distinguished from documented history. Beyond the details, it expresses Rose's love for her city and her trust in prayer. And this love, prayer, and penance filled Rose's life until her final years, which were marked by illness and an ever-deepening union with God. The final years of Saint Rose of Lima's life were marked by illness and an ever-deepening union with God, amid great sufferings that she accepted with love and patience. Her life, always marked by penance and suffering, was crowned by a painful illness, which Rose endured with exemplary fortitude as she united herself to the suffering Christ. In her final years, Rose was welcomed into the home of a devout family who cared for and looked after her, and there she spent the last stage of her life. Her health, weakened by her penances and the austerities of her life, gradually deteriorated, and Rose had to endure a painful and prolonged illness. The sufferings of her illness were added to the penances she had practiced throughout her life, and Rose accepted them with love as a participation in the Passion of Christ. Rose endured her illness with exemplary fortitude and patience, without complaint, uniting her sufferings to those of Christ. Her love for the crucified Christ, which had guided her entire life, was now manifested in the way she bore her illness, offering it out of love and uniting herself to the suffering Lord. Tradition preserves a prayer that Rose repeated in her sufferings, asking Christ to increase her pains, provided that he also increased her love. Her illness was thus a path toward ever greater union with Christ. Amid her illness, Rose persevered in her life of prayer and union with God, which grew ever deeper as the end drew near. Far from distancing her from God, her sufferings united her more closely to Him, purifying her and preparing her for the definitive encounter. Her soul was gradually detaching itself from everything, becoming ever more fully united to Christ in a growing intimacy. Rose was preparing, through suffering and prayer, to pass into eternity. The final years and illness of Saint Rose, marked by suffering and by a growing union with God, thus crowned a life of penance and love. Rose bore her illness with exemplary fortitude and patience, uniting her sufferings to those of Christ and growing in union with God. And so, after a brief but intense life given entirely to God, Rose reached the end of her earthly pilgrimage and died a holy death while she was still young. Saint Rose of Lima died in the year 1617, while still young, at just 31 years of age. Her death, though premature in human eyes, was the crowning of a brief but intense life, entirely given to God. Rose's death caused great mourning in Lima, where she was already venerated as a saint. Rose died after her painful illness in the peace of God, having entrusted her soul to the Lord whom she had loved with all her strength. Her death, which occurred when she was only 31, was the passage to glory of a young woman who had lived a life of the highest holiness. Although she died young, in her brief life, she had attained a fullness of love and union with God that many do not reach in a long lifetime. The brevity of her life did not prevent the fullness of her holiness. Rose's death caused great mourning in the city of Lima, where she was already known and venerated for her holiness. Crowds attended her funeral, and the entire city wept over the death of that young saint. Her reputation for holiness, already great during her lifetime, was revealed in the city's mourning and in the veneration with which she was buried. Lima mourned one of its most illustrious daughters, the first flower of holiness in its garden. Rose's death, while she was still young, shows that holiness does not depend on the length of life, but on the intensity of love. Rose lived only 31 years, but she lived them fully, entirely devoted to God. Her brief but intense life is an example that holiness can be attained in just a few years if one lives with love. The brevity of her life makes the fullness of her holiness even more admirable and makes her a model for young people. The death of Saint Rose in the year 1617 and Lima's mourning thus crowned a brief but intense life entirely devoted to God. Rose died young, at just 31, but she had attained an admirable fullness of holiness. Her death caused great mourning in Lima, where she was already venerated as a saint, and after her death, her reputation for holiness only continued to grow, nourished by the many miracles attributed to her intercession. After the death of Saint Rose, her reputation for holiness, already great during her lifetime, only continued to grow, nourished by the many favors and miracles attributed to her intercession. This reputation for holiness and these miracles moved the Church to begin the process for the official recognition of her sanctity, which would culminate in her canonization. Rosa's reputation for holiness was already great during her lifetime, for those who knew her admired her virtue, her penance, her charity, and her union with God. After her death, this reputation grew, and her tomb became a place of veneration, where the faithful came to ask for her intercession. The memory of the young saint spread throughout Lima and across the entire viceroyalty of Peru, and the faithful began to invoke her name. Numerous favors and miracles were attributed to Rosa's intercession. The faithful who turned to her in their needs experienced her intercession, and accounts of healings and graces obtained through her mediation began to spread. These miracles, later examined by the Church during the canonization process, confirmed Rosa's reputation for holiness and contributed to her official recognition. The Christian people recognized Rosa as a powerful intercessor before God. Rosa's reputation for holiness moved the Church to begin the process for the official recognition of her sanctity. Testimonies were collected from those who had known her, and her life, virtues, and miracles were examined. This rigorous and detailed process sought to verify Rosa's holiness before officially proposing her for the veneration of the faithful. The speed with which the process was begun and advanced shows the strength of her reputation for holiness. The reputation for holiness and the miracles attributed to Saint Rose after her death thus moved the Church to begin the process for the official recognition of her sanctity. Her reputation, already great during her lifetime, grew after her death, nourished by the miracles attributed to her intercession. And this process would culminate in an event of great importance for all of America, the canonization of Rosa, which would make her the first saint of the American continent. The process for recognizing Rosa's holiness culminated in her canonization, that is, the Church's solemn declaration of her sanctity, which made her the first saint of the American continent, the first person born in the Americas to be raised to the altars. This event was of great importance for all of America and a cause for rejoicing for the Church. After examining her life, virtues, and miracles, the Church proceeded to Rosa's beatification and then to her canonization. She was canonized in 1671 by Pope Clement X, who declared her a saint and proposed her for the veneration of the entire Church. With this canonization, Rosa was inscribed in the catalogue of the saints, and her veneration was extended to the whole Church. The young woman from Lima was raised to the altars. The most significant aspect of this canonization is that Rosa was the first person born in the Americas to be canonized, the first saint of the New World. Her canonization was therefore an event of great importance for all of America, which saw one of its daughters raised to the altars and officially recognized as a saint by the Universal Church. America now had its first saint, the first flower of holiness from that continent to be canonized. Rosa's canonization was a cause of great rejoicing for America and for the entire Church. The New World, evangelized only a few decades earlier, was already giving the Church its first saint, a sign of the fruitfulness of evangelization and the blossoming of holiness in those lands. Rosa was becoming the glory of the Americas, a sign that holiness had taken deep root in the New World. Her canonization filled the peoples of America with joy. The canonization of Saint Rose in 1671, which made her the first saint of the Americas, was therefore an event of great importance for the entire continent and a cause for joy for the Church. Rosa, the first person born in the Americas to be canonized, became the glory of the New World. And because she was the first saint of the Americas, Rosa was proclaimed patron saint of the Americas and, in time, of other lands, such as the Philippines. As the first saint of the New World, Saint Rose of Lima was proclaimed patron saint of the Americas, and over time, her patronage extended to other lands, such as the Philippines and the Indies. Her status as patron saint of the Americas and of other peoples shows the universal reach of her devotion, which crossed the borders of her city and her continent. Saint Rose was declared the principal patron saint of America or of the New World, in recognition of her status as the continent's first saint. As the first flower of holiness from the Americas to be raised to the altars, Rosa became the patron saint of that continent, venerated as its protector and intercessor. The peoples of the Americas took her as their patron saint and venerated her with great devotion, proud to have in her their first saint. Rosa's patronage also extended to other lands beyond the Americas. She was proclaimed patron saint of the Philippines and the Indies, that is, of lands across the ocean to which devotion to the Saint of Lima had spread. Thus, devotion to Rosa crossed the borders of the Americas and reached as far as Asia, showing the universal reach of her worship. Rosa became the patron saint of peoples on different continents, united in their veneration of the Saint of Lima. Devotion to Saint Rose therefore spread throughout the Americas, the Philippines and other lands, and countless places, cities, churches and people bear her name or venerate her as their patron saint. Her name, Rosa, spread throughout the world, and devotion to her took deep root among the peoples who chose her as their patron saint. The first saint of the Americas became a universally venerated saint, whose devotion crossed borders and oceans. As patron saint of the Americas and the Philippines, Saint Rose of Lima thus manifests the universal reach of her devotion, which crossed the borders of her city and her continent. The first saint of the New World became the patron saint of peoples on different continents, universally venerated. And this young saint, the first flower of holiness from the Americas, continues to bear a message of great relevance, especially for young people today. Saint Rose of Lima, who lived for only 31 years and attained an exceptionally high degree of holiness in her youth, is an especially eloquent model for young people today. Her life shows that holiness is not a matter of advanced age, nor does it require a long life, but can be attained in youth if one lives with love and dedication to God. Rosa attained holiness while she was young, in the vigor of her youth, devoting to God the years that many young people dedicate to worldly pursuits. Her example shows that youth is not an obstacle to holiness, but can be a time of fullness in the love of God. Rose lived her youth not for the vanities of the world, but for God, and in doing so attained the highest holiness. She is thus a model for young people who wish to give their lives to God. In a special way, Rose is a model for young people in her victory over vanity. In a world like ours, in which young people are so exposed to the temptation of vanity, the worship of appearances, and the pursuit of admiration, the example of Rose, who overcame vanity and offered her beauty to God, is especially valuable. Rose teaches young people not to live for appearances, but for God, and to value the beauty of the soul above that of the body. Rose is also a model for young people in her ability to unite contemplation and action, prayer and charity. She was not only a contemplative, but also a woman devoted to serving the poor and the sick. Her example shows young people that dedication to God is expressed in love of neighbor, and that Christian life unites prayer with service to others. Rose teaches young people to love God and neighbor with all their strength. Rose, a model for young people today, thus shows that holiness can be attained in youth when it is lived with love and devotion to God. Her victory over vanity, her union of contemplation and action, and her dedication to God in her youth are an especially eloquent example for the young people of our time, and from her entire life and example emerges a message that remains fully relevant for Christians today. At the end of this journey through the life of Saint Rose of Lima, it is fitting to take up the message that her figure conveys to Christians today. For Rose is not merely a saint of the past, but a model and an intercessor whose example and teaching remain fully relevant for believers in our time. The first message of Saint Rose is that of victory over vanity and the primacy of inner beauty. In a world obsessed with appearance, physical beauty, and the admiration of others, Rose, who overcame vanity and offered her beauty to God, reminds us that true beauty lies in the soul, in grace, in holiness, and that we must live not for appearances, but for God. It is a message of great relevance in the culture of the image. The second message of Saint Rose is that of love for Christ crucified and the value of suffering offered out of love. Rose loved Christ crucified and wished to unite herself to him in suffering. Although we should not imitate her extraordinary penances, her example teaches us to love Christ, to contemplate his passion, and to offer our sufferings out of love, uniting them to those of Christ. In a world that shies away from suffering, Rose teaches us its value when it is accepted and offered out of love. The third message of Saint Rose is that of charity toward the poor and the despised. Rose united contemplation with charity and devoted herself to serving the poor, the sick, and indigenous people in whom she saw Christ. Her example reminds us that love of God is expressed in love of neighbor, especially the poorest and most despised. In the world marked by inequality, Rose invites us to draw near to those who suffer and to serve them with love. Saint Rose's message for today is therefore an invitation to overcome vanity and value inner beauty, to love Christ crucified and offer our sufferings out of love, and to practice charity toward the poor and the despised. Her example and teaching remain fully relevant. May her intercession and example help us to live these values. And to this young saint, the first flower of holiness in the Americas, we address our prayer as we conclude. O glorious Saint Rose of Lima, the first flower of sanctity in the Americas, a rose hidden among the thorns of penance and love for Christ crucified, prostrate before God, we lift our hearts to him through your intercession. You who, though young and beautiful, offered your beauty and your whole heart to God, overcoming vanity, obtain for us the grace to live not for appearances, but for God, and to value the beauty of the soul above that of the body. You who loved Christ crucified and desired to unite yourself to him in suffering, teach us to love the suffering Lord, to contemplate his passion, and to offer our sufferings out of love, uniting them to his. Though we may not imitate your extraordinary penances, obtain for us your love for Christ and your spirit of reparation, so that we may accept life's crosses with patience and offer them out of love. You who united the highest contemplation with the most ardent charity, and who devoted yourself to serving the poor, the sick, and indigenous people, in whom you saw Christ, kindle within us love for our neighbor. Teach us to unite prayer and service, to draw near to those who suffer, and to love especially the poorest and most despised, in whom the Lord is present. May our faith be expressed in works of charity. You who attained holiness while still young, and who are a model for the young people of today, intercede for the youth of our time. Obtain for young people the grace to give their lives to God, to overcome the vanities of the world, and to live for what has eternal value. May many young people, following your example, discover that true happiness is found in God, and generously devote their lives to him, as you did. Receive, O Saint Rose of Lima, this prayer that we offer to you today, and present it before the throne of God. Intercede for your city of Lima, for the peoples of the Americas and the Philippines who venerate you as their patroness, and for all of us, so that, following your example of love for Christ, victory over vanity, and charity toward the poor, we may live holy lives and one day come to contemplate the glory of heaven in your company and that of all the saints. Saint Rose of Lima, the first saint of the Americas, and a rose hidden among thorns, pray for us. Amen.